Support comes from Hampton Roads Community Foundation, partnering with donors from all walks of life to improve southeastern Virginia through grants, scholarships, and leadership initiatives. Learn more at hamptonroadscf.org.
Hello, everyone. I'm Barbara Ham-Lee. Jim Crow laws, enacted in the South starting in the 1870s and not ending until 1968, are a collection of local and state laws that legalized racial segregation and required separation of whites and blacks in public transportation, schools, restaurants, and hotels. These laws prohibited intermarriage and denied blacks the right to vote, hold jobs, and get an education. For Black people, the trauma of Jim Crow is generational and shows up in ways you may not expect. Up next on Another View, one journalist's quest for ending the trauma within his own family and ultimately the Black community. Stay tuned. Another View will be right back after this national, regional, and local news from NPR and WHRO News.
Discussing today's topics from an African-American perspective, this is Another View.
Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to Another View. I'm Barbara Ham-Lee. Just want to say a very warm welcome to Dina Lattimore. She is a radio executive and adjunct professor at Norfolk State University teaching public relations, and she joins us today to listen to the show and kind of check out what we do. So welcome, Dina. Thanks so much for joining us. So Lee Hawkins is an award-winning journalist, reporting for news outlets like Milwaukee Journal-Sentinel, Wisconsin State Journal, and most recently, the Wall Street Journal. So what made this accomplished journalist turn his skills inward to his own family's story, and in doing so, start the process to end generational trauma because of the Jim Crow South? It's trauma that goes far beyond the Hawkins family, but the lessons they've learned can help us all. Lee Hawkins, welcome to Another View. How you doing?
Hello. I'm wonderful. How are you today?
I'm doing great. So are you in Milwaukee or are you in New Jersey today?
Right now I'm traveling, and so I'm in the Chicago area.
Oh, okay.
Right after our National Association of Black Journalists last week. So I've been reporting ever since.
Oh, my goodness. And there's been so much that I could even ask you about that, but we're not going to go there today because we're here. We are here to talk about your podcast and your upcoming book. So the podcast is called What Happened in Alabama, and the upcoming book is, I'm Nobody's Slave, How Uncovering My Family's History Set Me Free. And that book comes out when?
In January 2025, but it's available on Amazon for pre-order right now.
Oh, okay. All right. Fantastic. So you've done all this. You're a professional journalist. You know, you're living the high life. What made you decide to take this journey that you're on now in terms of your family trauma, Jim Crow South, slavery, and decide that this is what's important to you right now?
Well, I think from the time I was a little kid, I think I was around 6 years old when I saw the movie Roots. Mm-hmm. And I saw Alex Haley digging into his history, and it always made me curious because my father was from Alabama, and I lived in Minnesota, but my father moved to Minnesota when he was 12 years old and kind of never looked back. And so when I was a kid, sometimes my father would have nightmares, and I would wake up in the morning and I would ask him, Dad, what were you dreaming about? And he would just say, Alabama, son, Alabama. Mm-hmm. But he would never really go into detail or really talk that much about his childhood. So it made me even more curious about our family's history in the South, how we came to America, and everything. So when Ancestry.com started to blow up in 2015 or so, mm-hmm. I took a DNA test, and that was the thing that made me start to realize, wow, I've investigated all these companies and everything. Why not investigate my family, not just for myself, but also for my father, who had many questions about his family history in the South as well.
So what did you discover overall? What were the first things that you discovered about your family?
Oh, my goodness.
I know that's a loaded question.
Well, no. I think what's really powerful, what I really love about your show is that even at the outset of this show, I was listening and you were talking about Jim Crow and what Jim Crow was. And you basically hit it right on the head. You just described it. But you describe apartheid, right? And apartheid is generally thought as something that happened in other places, in South Africa and other places in the world. But the truth is, America, after slavery, had a system of 100 years of American apartheid. And I think the thing that I discovered the most about my family was that I come from a father. I'm a descendant of Jim Crow apartheid survivors. And I think it's very important. That's a very important distinction to make, because there are those who lived through it, and those are any African Americans who lived, who are 60 years old or older, who lived in the American South when this system was in place. And I did not know that when I was a kid. When I was a kid, I was taught that Jim Crow was segregation. But when I dug into my family history, I understood that no, it wasn't just segregation. It was a crime against humanity in which both of my great grandfathers were murdered in Alabama. And since 1837, I've had a family member murdered every generation. And it all had to do, most of it had to do with being killed over land or livestock, entrepreneurship. And I come from a family of very ambitious, talented people. And like many African Americans, we owned land and people were killed for it. And so digging into the archives and reading these stories about my great-grandfather who was killed on my birthday, which is actually August 28th, which was the day that Dr. King gave the I Have a Dream speech and the day that Obama accepted the nomination. But it was also the day that Emmett Till was killed. And Emmett Till, I'm 52, Emmett Till was only killed 16 years before I was born.
Yeah.
And so that whole thing, all of this, that Jim Crow was a crime against humanity, and that my family arrived in America in Richmond, Virginia in the 1600s and served in the Revolutionary War on both sides of the Civil War. All of that was just explosive information, Barbara, and it was one of the main reasons why I decided to keep researching, because it's not just about my family. This isn't just a story about one American family. This is a story about the American family. Yeah. And the fact that not only do I have family members who are Black, but I also have family members right there in Petersburg, Virginia, with blonde hair and blue eyes.
And we want to talk about that family in a bit, but I want to ask you also, because I think that people today, in this era of racial reckoning that we're going through right now, there are a lot of people who say, "Oh, I just wish Black people would get over slavery." And when you put it in the context of Jim Crow, which is so much closer, if you will, to people living today, in terms of things that happened in this country, do you think that is a way to help them to understand more about what this system did to this group of people? Do you know what I mean? Because you can push slavery back and you can say, "Oh, that was 400 years ago. Give me a break," but which I've heard people say. But when you start talking about it in terms of Jim Crow, I think it takes on a little bit of a different meaning.
I think it takes on a different meaning as well. Okay. But I would say that I don't think that it will change the minds of many people, because I think that there are people who are invested in the idea of not compensating Black Americans for what they've been through, not giving Black Americans the credit for building this country, not giving Black Americans the credit for everything that we've been able to accomplish many times despite America, not because of America. And so, no, I don't think that will do any good, because I believe that there are many people in this country, millions of people, particularly right there in Virginia, who know exactly what Jim Crow was. That it was a system. To those of you who are listening who would say, why don't Black people get over slavery? You know darn well what apartheid was. You know exactly what it was. You knew that it was in your backyard. And because Black people built Virginia, right? And so I think it's very important for us to understand that, yes, maybe the young people, maybe there are people under the age of 60 all over this country who don't know what Jim Crow was. But the people over the age of 60, 65, all of them, all of y'all folks know exactly what Jim Crow was. Joe Biden knows what Jim Crow was. He was friends with Strom Thurmond. He was friends with John Lewis. He was friends with Jesse Helms. And of course they know that this was a system of apartheid. And so, and I would also say this, Barbara, when I dug into the history, I remembered that I did an interview with my father and an uncle who was 93 years old in 1991 when my father actually did muster the courage to go back to Alabama. And bless his heart, we did this interview with this uncle, and he was still mourning the murder of his father on August 28th, 1914. But he was also telling us about his grandmother. And his grandmother was a woman named Grandma Charity, great-great-grandma Charity to me, but it was his grandmother. And he was talking about how when they would work in the field, when they got their own farm, she would beat them with a belt if they didn't work fast enough. And he painted this picture of her almost in a humorous way, but as this deranged, crazy woman who was so mean to the kids. And so I remember that story, but what I didn't know at the time was that Grandma Charity was in bondage. She was enslaved for most of all the way into her early adulthood, so about 30 years, and then she lived another 60 years under Jim Crow apartheid. And so that was a critical thing that was kind of left out, but it's important to understand what she had been through. And it's also important to understand that not just Grandma Charity, but also on the other side of the family, my great-great-grandfather, Isaac Pugh, who was a private in the Civil War, Isaac Blakey, who was a private in the Civil War. And my family on the other side knew him too. So it's important for us to understand that our elders knew people who, the last generation of people who were enslaved, they were babysat by them. And if people believe that their grandparents don't influence their socialization, their worldview, and all of that, they're just not wanting to confront the truth. And so the fact is that we were not only impacted by the trauma that our ancestors went through when they were in bondage, but also it shaped the whole way that they raised us and the way that they looked at the world. So yes, slavery was a long time ago, but we are still touched by the people who lived through it. And so people need to be very careful how they talk about enslaved people, because these were not distant figures to us. These were our loved ones. These were our families. These were our great-great-grandparents.
So you grew up in Minnesota, and you talk about in your podcast about the spankings that you and your siblings used to endure, and which brought back tons of memories for me as I was listening to that. But the whole idea of spanking and whipping, as people would call it, to be protective, is something that is very hard for a 6-year-old to comprehend. But it is what in your research and so forth, you also found that that is one of the traumas that has passed down from generation to generation to generation. And it's really a conundrum of hurting someone in order to be protective of someone.
Yes, and that I found out was something that I always wondered about, because it wasn't just happening to me, but it was happening to all kinds of kids around me.
Mm-hmm.
And I'll tell you, Barbara, the ones who had parents who were from Mississippi or grandparents from Mississippi, they got it worse.
Mm-hmm.
And I always wondered, where all
Why?
of this came from. And I think that the first curiosity about it came when I saw Roots, and I saw the brutal, iconic scene of Kunta Kinte, the star character, being whipped to try to force him to take on the colonizer's last name.
Yeah.
And when I was watching that, my parents were sitting on the couch, and I'll never forget kind of looking back at them and realizing, this is what you do to me.
Mm-hmm.
And when I realized that, I always thought there was a connection, but I didn't really know what it was. And so once again, the reason I exposed the spanking was because that has everything to do with the system of the slave codes and the black codes, which were initially implemented right there in Virginia,
Mm-hmm.
which a system that was brought over, justice of the peace system, in which every white man, usually between the ages of 18 to 45, were deputized and had the permission and the codification of the government to whip or kill Black Americans, or Black people at the time, because we weren't considered Americans,
Mm-hmm.
who broke rules. And the rules could be things like being caught reading or writing, or being caught more than 4 Black people in a group without a white person present. And what that meant was that any white man who was on slavery patrol or Black Codes patrol duty could whip that person, usually 39 to 100 lashes. And so my great-great-grandmother, Charity, and my great-great-grandfather, Isaac, they were both whipped under this system, not only just the slave codes, but also during the Black Codes. So when they got their own farm,
And the Black Codes started after slavery to continue to keep Black people in a certain place.
Yes.
Is that correct?
And
Okay.
Yes, and flogging was a system that was brought over from the United Kingdom.
Mm-hmm.
In this entire system, there's a wonderful book written by Sally Haddon, which is all about the slave codes and the Black codes, and it talks all about Virginia and how Virginia was a leader in establishing this colonial structure that was all enforced by whipping. And so whipping is part of the American founding. It's part of our DNA. It's part of our fabric. And so if you look at people all over the South, we laugh about it now. We'll say, oh, my grandmama or my parents used to really whoop me and make me go get the switch. And there's that thin line between comedy and tragedy. But when I really look back on my own childhood and the childhood of many of the people I know, our parents undeniably loved us and embraced us and wanted to see us succeed. But those beatings were tragic, and they were very traumatizing. And I think it's important now for us to start to confront the truth of our country and the fact that 17 states still allow, it's actually legal for teachers to hit children in public schools.
Mm-hmm.
And of course, they are the slavery states, most of them. And there's a professor named Jeff Ward that has studied and found out that in the counties where lynching was most pronounced and most prolific, that's where the whipping of the children and the paddling of the children in the schools are most prolific. And of course, it affects Black children and Hispanic children disproportionately at higher rates. Black girls are hit at 3 times more than white girls, and there's no difference in the behavioral infractions. It's just that Black children and Hispanic children get it more. And, one of the great problems and the devastating nuances in that is that many of the people in the South in particular, in the system, the educational system who support corporal punishment are the educators and administrators who are of African American descent. And so that's one of the things that makes it very hard for this to be repealed, because there are many people in the system who believe that this was a part of our heritage and really don't know the history, that no, this wasn't a part of our heritage. This was a part of the colonial structure and the white supremacy of the past.
But they also were taught to believe that if they did not whip the children, and if we don't do this at home, then when you step out that door, you could get even worse.
Yes, and that is very true, that is a holdover from Jim Crow and from slavery, and that this is a protective measure, as you mentioned earlier. But the issue with that now is multitudinous. One of them is, I'll never forget that one of the hardest parts was that my father, when he used corporal punishment, he used it on my sister, right? He used it on his baby girl, and I always wondered, what did that really mean? What message did that send her about love and receiving love from a man? So that's one thing, is what this is telling our children, is telling them that violence is acceptable. And it's also not an assault on the parents and the grandparents and the people who used this, because they, of course, were responding to the system that they were living under. And that's part of the trauma that you pinpointed. Is part of the trauma is saying, I love my children so much that I fear for them, that if they go out there and they make one mistake and they're not absolutely perfect, or if they're accused of doing something that they didn't do, they could not only get in trouble, but they could be killed. And so I am going to scare the bejesus out of these children so that they will be under pressure all of the time, hyper vigilant, hyper cautious about everything that they do, and home and outside of the home.
And that even translates
where the trauma comes from.
Yeah, and that even translates to the talk that we have with our children about how to, if you get stopped by a police officer, 10 and 2 on the steering wheel, no fast movements. I mean, these are ways that this trauma continues to manifest itself as the generations go on.
Yes, you're right. I was telling somebody the other day that 90% of the lessons that I got when my father was teaching me how to drive had nothing to do with stop signs or stop or changing lanes. It was all about what happens if you get pulled over by the police. And you can imagine what that was like for a man who was brought up right there in Butler County, Alabama. It was like he was living through Jim Crow in Minnesota in the 1980s. He had never really let go of the rules that he had to follow in Jim Crow. And that caused some tension between us. For as close as we were, I was part of a different generation, but he was still thinking back in the trauma that he went through in apartheid.
So your sister Tiffany, she's your baby sister, right? She has started to make a change in terms of going back to the whippings and trying to change that trauma within generations to come within your family. What is she doing, and what does she do differently now that she understands what this meant and how it has manifested itself over the years?
Well, my sister Tiffany is one of my biggest heroes, and as was my father, Lee Hawkins Sr. as well. And I think the reason I love them both so much and respect them so tremendously was that they both questioned this system as time went on. My father got a master's degree in psychology, and he started to understand childhood trauma and that he had gone through childhood trauma and the way that can impact people long term and actually affect their life expectancy. But my sister Tiffany was always in the home. You always have that kid who's questioning everything. I mean, of course, I was questioning because I became a journalist, but she was also the one way before me who, figured out this is wrong, and she actually ran away a few times because she was so troubled by this system, and so because of that very conscientious look at the family system made Tiffany say, I'm going to do this differently. I'm not going to use the belt on my children, and I'm going to break that cycle. And it was just a decision that she made, but it wasn't just a decision about that. It was also a decision about opening herself up to going to therapy. And it was because she had gone to therapy that I ended up being open to going to therapy. And asked my parents to go to therapy. And my father went to therapy with me. And this is all detailed in the book. In the book, I Am Nobody's Slave. But when my father opened up to all of this awareness, it was like the last 20 years of his life was just this profound evolution where he just evolved into this man who had plain and clear-eyed fashion been able to see how Jim Crow affected him and decided that he was not going to continue to be in shackles to that old way of thinking and to everything that he had been through.
If you're just joining us, we're talking with journalist Lee Hawkins about generational trauma in the Black community because of slavery and Jim Crow. Lee has a podcast called What Happened in Alabama. You can find it at whathappenedinalabama.org. Wow, Lee, there's just so much. What are some other ways that, well, let me ask you this question, because there are some Black people who romanticize, I'll use that word, Jim Crow, segregation. They say we were better off when things were separate because we had our own stores and we had our own churches and we had our own schools and so forth. Is that part of the trauma too, that we're made to think?
Well, I think it is. I have people in my family who say it wasn't that bad. And when I hear that statement, I feel real sorrow. And I think part of it is because I know the data in terms of, and even, just talking to the elders about the ones who were courageous and not afraid to talk about it are usually the ones who actually marched and participated in the Montgomery bus boycotts and all of the different things that led to America being, brought closer to a step closer to becoming American. And those people in the family were the people who told the truth and said, there were, 20 kids sharing one book in schools. And that I have a cousin who was actually graduated, and then she was put into a school as a teacher without formal teacher training, and she was responsible for almost an entire school of children. And so when you look at the resources and, even down to the separate drinking fountains, people would talk about how when they would go out in the public, they wouldn't use the bathroom because the bathroom wasn't kept up, number one, and they wouldn't drink the water because the water would make them go to the bathroom, but it would also, the water was disgusting because they never took care of the Black facilities. And so from that all the way down to people, even in today's times, producing letters from when they applied to medical school. There's a famous one that a guy just put out, about a year ago, which was signed by an official from Emory University saying, we don't allow Negroes. And so we're going to send you your money back, for your medical school application. And so this is why HBCUs were there, because there were so many institutions that denied Black people, including Georgetown University for many years, right? Which was built on slavery and funded by slavery. And so for people to say that that was better is almost a slap in the face or it is a slap in the face to Fannie Lou Hamer and to Dr. Martin Luther King and to Bayard Rustin, and all of the people who led the movement, and John Lewis, who led the movement for us to not just be integrated, but to have equal, at least on paper, equal rights under the law.
Absolutely.
And I think that's really the hard part that many people struggle with in this country, is that racism or equality, racial equality, is a new concept in America that we are just getting used to. And what I mean by that is, as you mentioned, it's only been through the Civil Rights Act of 1964 and then again in 1968 that Black people, that America has even tried to say that Black people are equal to white people on paper. And so we're still getting used to this idea subconsciously that Black people are equal.
And believing it within ourselves, as well as convincing the greater community, but also internalizing that message for ourselves.
There you go.
Because that
word.
Yes.
That word, internalization, is a powerful word, and it is, the word you use is the center of my work, is to understand the psychology of internalization and the fact that, of course, there are going to be Black people who say that Jim Crow wasn't that bad because we were socialized under this system. There has never been a time in this country that white Americans were present, that Black Americans weren't also present. We were, Crispus Attucks was the first person to be killed in the American Revolution for the establishment of this country. We are American, and this is our belief system is intertwined and inextricably tied to the belief system of America. And so it's almost as if you would have to be very conscious and to continue to work and to study and to understand, to dismantle this from your mind. And some people call it decolonization of the mind. But that's not something that just Black Americans should do. It's something that all
everybody should do. Absolutely.
For us to advance as a nation. And it's very, very hard to break all of these different patterns and these generational cycles without knowledge and without enlightenment, and also without a willingness to learn and to cease from acting like you know what you're talking about when you haven't done the research.
Done the work, exactly.
And I think that's the part that a lot of Americans have to contend with and confront.
Yeah. I want to play a clip from What Happened in Alabama.org, your podcast. This one comes from episode 9, Death by Jim Crow, and it's talking about food addiction. So let's take a listen.
To deal with life's calamities, secrets, and stresses, my dad didn't turn to alcohol, cigarettes, or drugs. Instead, food was where we found our joy. In fact, the last time I saw my father in person was at the Old Country Buffet, a place where our family and tons of other Black families would often go after church dressed in our Sunday best for food and fellowship. On any and every given Sunday, I made sure to load up on 3 or 4 plates of fudge-covered ice creams. I was never scolded for that because my dad was doing it right along with me. And it wasn't until I became a journalist that I learned that chronic stress from childhood trauma and racism can lead to food addiction as a coping mechanism. These stressors trigger the body's fight or flight response, releasing stress hormones. Elevated cortisol levels increase cravings for high-fat, high-sugar foods, providing temporary comfort and relief. Food becomes a way to self-soothe, creating a cycle of emotional eating. Additionally, repeated exposure to trauma and discrimination can disrupt the brain's reward system, making people more susceptible to addictive behaviors. In my father's, my sister Tiffany's, and my case, this sometimes resulted in compulsive eating. We may not look like it, but just like my father, Tiffany and I have struggled with food addiction too.
You still struggling?
I was just on a deadline last night, and I had to have a Snicker bar at, 1 a.m.
Yep.
This is, once again, under stress. And it really evolved from my studying that I did as part of a fellowship at University of Southern California, Annenberg, which was a child well-being fellowship.
Mm-hmm.
And what it really helped me understand was adverse childhood experiences, and the fact that if you have 4 or 5 of those adverse childhood experiences, which, as I mentioned earlier, could stem from, having a family member lynched,
Mm-hmm.
or, moving like my father did abruptly to Minnesota because his mother died, divorces, all of these different things that children go through. It hardwires your brain to respond with a fight or flight response. And enough of those end up hardwiring your body to release those stress hormones. And then what ends up happening is your system, if you've been having this in your system for 18 years and you're 18 years old, that means that you're already halfway to a heart attack, diabetes, or cancer. And the study shows that people who struggle with multiple adverse childhood experiences will have a shortened life expectancy of, on average, 20 years if there are not things that are done to intervene. And I do things to intervene. I exercise, I meditate. I'm a person of faith. I have a strong community. I have friendships. I had people who supported me when I was a kid, including my parents, my church community, my Black community. I had white teachers, a few of them, who really saw potential in me and embraced me and encouraged me. And these are all interventions for children. But rather than, we were strong Southern Baptist people, so we were not people who were going to be outwardly engaging in drinking and drugs and all of the different other things that people do to cope. Ours was food. And yes, food is something that is very acceptable. It cuts across race and class and all of those lines. And there are many people who struggle with food addiction as a response to difficult childhood and stress that they have in their lives. And so when you understand that, that's when you start to begin to develop those modalities that will help you address it. And I'm in that ongoing fight, but I'm doing a lot better than I did before. And I feel so much better when I'm able to exercise and sweat and all of the different things that I need to do, knowing that I struggle with that issue.
Yeah. I remember listening to one of the episodes, and you were when you interviewed your mom, who was very courageous. Both of your parents were very courageous and very open and honest about things that they experienced. But your mother was talking about you as a journalist and how afraid she was for you because of your success. And, I had to chuckle, but then I had to think back on my own family and my own parents, because, we're thinking, oh, we're journalists. We're out here. We're looking for the stories and reporting history and, and so forth. And they are like, yeah, but, we're scared for you.
Yes. And, when I was a kid, I guess I was an early bloomer, and I still haven't matched the success of my childhood. When I was a kid, I was class president all 4 years, youth governor of the state of Minnesota in the YMCA Youth and Government program, and I was one of the few Black kids in all of those spaces. So the school that I grew up in, Maplewood, Minnesota, was 99% white. And yet those kids elected me class president all 4 years. And I was very, very outspoken about racism. I was passionate, if not self-righteous, about eradicating racism.
I should have been your sister.
Yeah, well, of course, and this is the thing. I mean,
same thing.
God puts us into these careers for a reason, and you, of course, you are my sister in that sense, and this is all who we are shaped to be. But that was a privilege that I had that previous generations didn't have, and so the question that I always ask is, how can I have this position and not represent my people? And I think that was hard for my parents to process, because as I say in the podcast, I did receive letters from a white supremacist in the 10th grade year that were sent directly to my school, and we didn't know who was sending the letters. These letters were going to Black people all over the state of Minnesota. About 2 years later, it was discovered who this person was. His name was Elroy Stock. He's deceased now. But he was a white supremacist, and he was a person who wasn't a poor person. He was a very wealthy executive who had just given $500,000 to Augsburg College at the time, and they actually tried to give the money back, and it was a whole big controversy. But the key was that for a week, I had police escort to school. And when you think about what that means, is we hear so much about the Little Rock Nine and all of these courageous people who integrated schools, but I don't think people realize that after the passage of the Civil Rights Act, there was a whole generation of Black children who integrated America's neighborhoods and schools, because we were some of the people who moved to the suburbs to participate in that American dream. But the experience that we went through, called the N-word every day, that was nothing to me. It was something that happened every single day. Yes, in Minnesota, the state that killed George Floyd, right, and also killed Philando Castile. Let's get the story right. It wasn't just in the South. And that's one thing that I want all your listeners to know. I am not this guy from the North coming down and, judging the South and saying that racism started and ended and everything was in the South. No, that's not true. Jim Crow was a system that started in the North, right? And so we invented Jim Crow while slavery was going on, and I saw remnants of that in my childhood. And that was why my parents were afraid, because I think, Barbara, one of the things that are hard for people to see is that Black people are multidimensional people. A lot of us are racism is not a one-dimensional thing. It's something that affects people in different ways. And you see it at the highest echelons of Black America. You saw Barack Obama go through it. You saw, you're going to see Kamala Harris go through it. I'm sure you go through it. And it's a different kind of racism that comes not just from external to the community, but also internal to the community, where people have embraced these stereotypes of what they think a real Black person should be. And if you do not fit those stereotypes by becoming the class president or becoming somebody who thrives in predominantly white spaces, then you're not considered Black.
Yep, you're not like those other Black people.
Yes, or you're not like us.
Right. Yes.
And my mother was afraid for me because she felt that I was taking opportunities from white people, right, and from white children, and the parents were often thinking, oh, another Lee Hawkins thing, here's Lee Hawkins again, and that was a problem because my parents thought, you know what, you're disrupting the system. And if you do too much, if you are too outspoken, if you challenge them too much, if you ask too many questions, you're going to get the whole family killed. And that was because my family did have family members who were murdered. My grandfather was murdered, right? My grandfather was murdered. And I also had my grandfather's first cousin was murdered in 1959 in South Dakota, of all places, because of my family's land. And so who am I to say that my parents were wrong? The truth is that the truth is somewhere there in the middle. But I wasn't going to, it didn't matter. I wasn't going to stop. The song says, I ain't going to let nobody turn me around. I don't know where it came from, but it's in my heart. And that's the way I operated as a little kid, and I'm sure you can relate to that.
Yes,
there are just
very much so.
Who decide, you make a decision that you're going to ask questions, and this is what you want to do for a living, and this is how you're going to commit your life, and that's who I was. And that was hard for my parents to accept.
So, Lee, one of the things that struck me was in your conversation about Meet the Pews, who are the white side of your family that you discovered through DNA, and turns out you even knew someone professionally who turned out to be a distant cousin, which was a whole
Yeah.
nother thing. And we only got about 10 minutes left in the show, so I'm trying to condense this as much as I can. But what
Yeah.
struck me about that interview more than anything else is as I'm listening to the cousin in Petersburg talking about this was just our heritage. This is what my folks did during that time. And he's describing the way that the South was back then, during the Confederacy and all of that. And your reaction was so forgiving and so even. I will use that term. And I wondered, when you went home or went to your hotel after that encounter, did you process it differently, or have you been able to start to work through the tolerance or to build up your tolerance for things that are just so hurtful?
Well, that's a good question. I think that my whole life I haven't had that much faith in the benevolence of white people.
Mm-hmm.
And I think that's because of where I grew up.
Mm-hmm.
And it's also because I understand tribalism and the way that tribalism is a prehistoric reality about human nature. I mean, that's just how primates think. And the truth is that whoever is dominant in the society is going to write the rules, and the socialization flows down from that. And so 4 in 10 white people in this country, according to the Pew Center, feel more sympathetic for the Confederacy than they do for the Union side. Mm-hmm. And the fact is that I felt complex emotions when I went back to my hotel, mainly because the Pews, my white cousins, who I'm related to because of slavery, and that great-great-grandmother that I talked about was
Mm-hmm.
sexually assaulted by an enslaver, and as a result, that's why we're related. The fact is that we went to dinner. They invited me into their home, opened up 400 years worth of archival information.
Wow.
And my cousin Jim, who was a person who I was related to and didn't even know it for 30 years because we actually worked together, and he had the name of my grandmother's maternal name, and we didn't even know we were related. He's been extraordinarily kind. As a matter of fact, he was one of the people who was there for me the most when my father died of a massive cardiac arrest in 2019. Mm-hmm. And so I think that complexity of the American story, not just within families, but also in the American family, is something we have to dig deeper into. You know, we're in this culture right now of hyper-partisanship where, people completely dismiss people for having a different opinion. That doesn't get us anywhere. What gets us somewhere is things like the debate between William F. Buckley and James Baldwin at Oxford University, mm-hmm. where they both spoke their piece about the future of the American Negro at the time. Yeah. And I think the truth came out because Baldwin was, in my opinion, so much more enlightened, and he made the case. And at that time, we knew exactly where the truth lied. And so I think for me, the reason I did not try to change Lloyd, because he's an 88-year-old man who mm-hmm. has lived the life that he's lived, was because that wasn't why I was there. Why I was there was to accept his gracious invitation for me to look into the family history and to share the Black side of the family's oral history with him. See, the thing about this genealogy process is that, yes, genealogy is powerful, but it's usually when someone was born and when they died. But that dash in between is something that can only be filled in through oral history. And so we worked together on both, and we continue to work together on both of the sides of the family to fill in the gaps. And I also have other white cousins all over this country who are not necessarily, who absolutely are not people who celebrate the Confederacy as part of their heritage, but just understand that this is the truth of our country. We have to confront it, and we can't control the past. We're not responsible for the sins of our forefathers, but we are responsible for the present and the future. And I have to say that I have cousins all over this country who are white people who I'm related to because of slavery, who I do consider family. And I think that that's for all of the things that I've said about the legacy of white supremacy in this country. I think the openness that they've had, and the fact is a lot of them call me. I don't always call them, or I don't always email them, but they're just checking in because they know that this is a very, very difficult process for all of us. There's a certain amount of trauma that they went through. Many of them were whipped as children, right? Of course they were. If it came from them, then of course they were whipped as well.
Yeah.
And so I think the whole American family has to open up, and I encourage people who have slavery in their family to cross the aisle and to start to do this research. It's the only way that you can get the full story, is to start talking to one another. And I'm very grateful to Lloyd for opening that up.
So in the last minute and a half or so that we have, please tell our audience, the question I want to ask you is, how did you learn to forgive your family for the traumas that they continue to pass down now that you have a better understanding of why?
Well, in the book, I Am Nobody's Slave, How Uncovering My Family's History Set Me Free, which comes out in January, I detail the love that my family showed me. And the fact that once again, complexity. I mean, understanding how strongly my father loved me. He was my best friend on the planet. And I think I was able to forgive him when he acknowledged that he did it and that he thought that it was wrong and that we needed to fix this. And I think what people need to understand is you don't always need to have a conscientious parent that decides to apologize for what you did. But for what they did, but I think it's important to study them and to understand what they went through and what previous generations went through, so you can finally accept that it wasn't because they hated you, but it was because of they hated themselves in many ways, and because of the things that they had gone through, that they did touch them in too tender of a place for them to even begin to process. But we can all process it differently if we have courage to confront it. And it's a privilege that new generations have that the generations before us didn't. So I encourage everybody to seize that opportunity.
Lee Hawkins, it has been such a pleasure talking with you. The podcast is called What Happened in Alabama. You can find it at whathappenedinalabama.org. And the book comes out in January, I'm Nobody's Slave, How Uncovering My Family's History Set Me Free. You can go to Amazon to pre-order. Thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you. God bless you. God bless Virginia.
Thank you. And we hope that what you've heard over the past hour will make you reflect on your own family dynamics and cause you to take a deeper dive into understanding the impact of Jim Crow laws on Black families today. Share this show with someone you love. Find the podcast at anotherviewradio.org or Spotify or wherever you go for your podcast listening pleasure. Next week on Another View, Dr. Eric LaVille with a deep dive into what Project 2025 means for the African American community. Our theme music is an original composition created especially for Another View by Jay Sennett. Lisa Godley is our show producer. Jordan Christie is our audio engineer. And Dr. Barry Graham was on phones. I'm Barbara Ham Lee. Have you registered to vote? What are you waiting for? Go to vote.gov for more information. And let's get together again next Thursday at noon for Another View.
Support comes from Hampton Roads Community Foundation, carrying out your charitable wishes forever, whether it's helping shelter animals, feeding the homeless, enhancing the arts, or supporting students. Learn more at leaveabequest.org.